Hello and welcome to the Wickershire Project Off-Grid. My apologies for the wind. Beep, 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 beep. Tick, 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 tick. So the subject matter I'm thinking is more of that Solar 101. Maybe a bunch of other topics today to talk about. Behind me in these solar arrays, you'll see 3 panels. So I've got an array here, I've got an array there, and I've got another array over here. And those all face south. On the western side is another 3 panels. It's an extra array. Around the front of the house is the same as those panels, is another array. Now, my charge controller is 80 amps and it handles 4,000 watts, but you might be saying, yeah, you have 4,800 watts of panels. As the sun travels across the sky, only so many of those panel arrays are going to be lit up producing power throughout the day. So I'm really not ever going to get a perfect 4,800 watts and put any extra amount of voltage creating heat inside the unit while it's converting. Now we have a mix of array because, well, at the time it was the most affordable option. On our solar arrays, the ones that are hooked in series here. So on that panel there's a positive on that side, and then on this side there's the negative. Each panel is hooked in series to each other. They're positive to negative, positive to negative. We have one hot out and one negative out. What that does for us is it raises the panel voltage up, but it keeps those amps pretty low. The job of the MPPT charge controller inside is to handle the high voltage coming in. Because I have a 48 volt battery bank, I need a much higher VOC, a much higher voltage coming across those panels. So it'd be best for us to keep at least 2 in series, if not 3. It is not ideal for us to hook 4 panels up in series. What'll happen in the winter is we'll exceed that 150 VOC inside that charge controller. It'll go into a fault error mode. It'll go into protection mode. It'll shut down, and we can't have that. And the sound inside the house is pretty annoying. Beep, 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 beep. So when you're building a system, you have to look at the charge controller's parameters. What is that charge controller meant for? Is it PWM? If so, if that's strictly what that little tiny charge controller is for, use those for a 200 watt system or lower. They're typically about 10 or 15 amps of handling capability, more likely like 10 amps. Again, I mentioned in a previous video before this one that most of those charge controllers that you see for 10, 15, 20 bucks on Amazon or AliExpress, they're all extremely cheaply made. Basically using power MOSFETs and transistors in there to handle the capability. Sometimes they got a little toroidal transformer for boost bucking, and it's really hit or miss. Most of the time you're going to lose out and waste your money. You're going to want to go with name brands. I can tell you that right off. Very rare are you ever going to get a good deal on something cheap. It's cheap for a reason. When doing solar, the first thing you need to do is learn Ohm's law. Ohm's law is a little triangle mathematic equation that works for all your electrical components, and it will tell you what the tolerances are and what's acceptable and not acceptable in your build. Ohm's law is basically wattage divided by voltage will give you amps. It's really simple. It's what you got to know. That's it. That's it. Learn that. Practice it. If you're going to do solar, if you're going to deal with AC and DC currents and all that, learn Ohm's law. It's not hard. You learn basic addition, subtraction, and multiplication. Well, Ohm's law is just that. It is just division, a simple division, one division. Again, it is your total watts divided by your nominal voltage will give you the amount of current, amps. Then you can go from there. Solar panels typically use a 10 gauge wire. We're here in America, so we're going to use American wire gauge, and that's 10 gauge. I don't know what that is in millimeter. I could find that out for you guys, but I'll leave it up to you to go research that. That's an educational value thing right there, something you should learn. So what we do with these panels is to protect them with the DC breaker box that is behind there. Each series of panels has to go into one breaker. For these 3 panels, I have a 15 amp breaker, 15 amp breaker, 15 amp breaker, and for those 4 panels, I use a 20 amp breaker. So that's my first stage in protection. Between each of these panels is a plate that connects them together for bonding, and that's for grounding. Then we'll pound a rod into the ground 3 feet, and we'll bond that with a thick solid copper wire, and it protects it against a lightning strike, we hope. On the back wall, right about there, is a main switch, and that cuts power to all the panels. If I need to service them, I'll cut that power, I'll go to the breaker box, and I'll pop all those switches down. At that moment, if I think there's any issue going on with the solar, I'll take a multimeter while the DC breakers are in the off position. So you'll have a negative bus bar, but all your negatives tied into it. Doesn't matter where they are, everything in negative ties into the negative bus bars. Just one big chunk of metal, little screws in it, all the negatives get screwed into that. But on the positive side, it's going to have this big metal plate with teeth where the breakers line up in conjunction, and all the positives get put on that giant plate. And then there's a huge lug up there, and that runs out your positive feed. While those breakers are turned off, it is then and only then you can test each of the series of panels or panels in general to see what they're doing, whether they're producing power or not. If the diodes burn out and fail, are they cracked? Is there something wrong with the solar panel? The MC4 connectors inside, one burned out from a spike of high voltage. Things break down, stuff does happen. Once those breakers on the positive side are switched off, you can then take your multimeter and test the plate. You should have 0 voltage, provided you also hit the breakers inside the house to cut the battery, solar charger, and inverter off. You got to disconnect the battery power as well. It's ideal to shut the power off from the panels first, so they stop producing power. So what I'll do is I'll come out here and I'll pop the breaker switches off one by one, click, 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 click. I'll go to the side of the house up there for the east and west, to the breaker box up there, and I'll pop those off, 1, 2, and that handles all the power that's rushing in. Once that rushing in current is cut, I'll go inside to where the battery is, and I'll either switch off the positive break in the line, or in my case, I have a giant battery with also DC breakers built into each battery that I have access to, and I'll just start hitting those breakers off one at a time. Tick, 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 tick. My system will then power down. We'll come out here to that breaker box while those breakers are in the off position, and on the lower side where the solar panel feeds into the breaker, we'll put our multimeter on the positive, and then we'll run it over to the negative. At that point, it will show us the voltage. At this time, you should have a notebook or your phone app or something you can record the data on if you're doing this manual. You should know what the voltage is at certain points in the year. What is that voltage in the dead cold of winter, and what is that voltage in the dead heat of summer? This is going to allow you to know whether to keep your panels in 2s, in 3s, and 4s, or singles. It allows you the flexibility when dealing with MPPT charge controllers. Again, on PWM, pulse width modulation, those cute little ones that you guys like to learn on. Some people need them for a shed, to keep a light on, to charge a phone, or to maintain a battery, such as a golf cart or your truck or car or motorcycle. They're wonderful for keeping lights on and for that purpose in general of maintaining those small batteries. When you're going to run a tiny home, you're going to need a large solar field. At any given point all throughout the year, no matter what your solar field is, if it's not tracking, you're probably going to get about half the amount of power. If they sit in position and they're not facing the sun perpendicular perfectly, well, those photons are bouncing off the glass and into the atmosphere, and they're gone. Losing a lot of power that way. Bringing you into why MPPT works is because you'll have a chain of panels to bring the voltage up, but not higher than the VOC of the charge controller. Once that voltage is brought up and into the house, the MPPT solar charge controller will look at that voltage and match it with the battery. Then it does its power point tracking and brings it down to a perfect level. And as voltage comes down, amps go up, you're supercharging, and that's where you get your boost from MPPT charge controllers. Lucy, knock it off! Just angry little goose. Why? Now for us, because we have so many panels feeding into the house, the lines that go into the house are 4 gauge. AC likes a solid wire and travel through the center of it. Well, DC likes to travel on the outside. So we use 4 gauge stranded wire, and that is the biggest we can stick into our charge controller. From there, the wires coming out are also 4 gauge going down to our battery bank. You're going to want to torque those onto specifications of the battery you're using. Great, fine. You're producing solar power through a charge controller. You're using MPPT or PWM to suit your needs. But what happens when you need to withdraw that power to run things? Well, the battery bank itself is going to put out X amount of amps. Whether it's a lead type or a lithium type, they all have amp ratings on which they can take a charge and dissipate a charge. Of course, the bigger the battery bank is, the more power you're going to have accessible to you. At that point, you're going to have an inverter. There are 2 types of inverters. There's high frequency modified sine wave inverters, and that's all the common ones you see being sold at all these big box stores. Those little, I think I showed on the last video, they're just, very lightweight. They're not any good. I don't like them personally. They have a very high crazy wattage rating on them, and we all know that's not true. And what happens is once you try to draw current from them, it's running through little transformers and little MOSFETs bolted to the side of the inverter itself, and there's a lot of heat being produced, and you're trying to pull too many amps at a low voltage, converting it to a high voltage, and they fail, they beep, they shut off, and you can't power a lot of tools by them. Small things like TVs, laptops, phones seem to work just fine, and lights do just fine on them. But off-grid, you're going to need some power, so you're going to have to get a low-frequency, pure sine wave inverter. You can tell if you have one because A, they're super expensive. You spend a lot of money on them, and they weigh as much as a small child. Your inverter is going to be hard to pick up, and it should be. That means it's made with real components. And you'll have the option of 120 or 240. General 120 will work. You're going to need at least 3,000 watts or higher to run a lot of things. Once you start getting up into the 3,000 to 10,000 range, somewhere in there, the higher the wattage of that low frequency pure sine wave inverter, the more you can do with it. Some of the hardest things to start is an air compressor. So on a modified sine wave box, don't try to start up an air compressor. It's not going to work. We're talking the big ones that tire shops use to pull tires off or pull engines apart. It's not going to happen. Would I trust our 6K Ames inverter to run such a big pump? I think it just meets the requirement where it could do that. Thanks to Dave Paz. I think he has a video out there. Mr. Dave Paz of YouTube has tested out that inverter, that specific one I got from him, and the battery bank that he built for us that's in the house that is running our off-grid cabin. Our off-grid tiny shed-to-house cabin. It's a lot of words put together. Just to rehash, in the summertime, as the temperatures go up, these panels work a lot less efficient. The voltage drops on them, which means you'll get less amps out of them. In the wintertime, as the panels are colder, you get shorter light hours, but the voltage goes up, so you make more amps. But you need the correct charge controller, MPPT, to take advantage of these situations. Thanks for watching this episode of the Wickersire Project. I hope you learned something. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. The more you watch the Wickersire Project, the more you're going to learn, because we'll repeat those things over and over and just drill them into your brains. Bye for now.